He walked into every room like a verdict, not because of the sword at his hip or the uniform stripped of decorations he no longer needed, but because of the silence that preceded him. The kind of silence that falls when predators enter a space, and every creature with working instincts understands on a biological level that the calculus of the room has permanently shifted. Lucien d'Arquent, Duke of the Northern Reaches, blind warlord of the Ardennes campaign, the man 3 emperors had used as a weapon and none had managed to put down, walked into his own wedding reception like a man already calculating the exits. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was deciding who wouldn't make it to one. Stay until the Jasmine. Everything changes at the Jasmine. The candles in the grand ballroom of Volantis Palace had been burning for 4 hours by the time the blind duke finally moved away from his post at the eastern colonnade. 400 guests. 12 noble houses represented in their finest brocade and ancestral jewels. An orchestra playing Salieri arrangements that cost more per evening than most provincial families earned in a year. The empire's most powerful men and women packed into a space designed to display wealth, the way a hunting lodge displays trophies, not for beauty, but for dominance. And in the center of it all, standing at the precise midpoint between the 2 competing power structures the marriage had been engineered to reconcile, Lucien d'Arquent had not smiled once. He didn't need to. His face was doing something far more effective. It was doing nothing. The guests who had never been in the same room as the Duke before, and there were remarkably few, given his decade of imperial service, had expected something more legible. The rumors painted him in vivid competing colors. Savage, brilliant, broken. The kind of man who interrogated enemy commanders for 3 days without sleep and then wrote detailed military poetry about the experience. The kind of man who had lost his sight to a battlefield explosion and subsequently won 2 more campaigns, which suggested either extraordinary tactical genius or a terrifying comfort with damage. What they got instead was a man who stood perfectly still and let the room come apart around him. He was tall in the way that men who have spent years in the field become tall, not elegant, but load-bearing. Dark hair cut with the blunt practicality of someone who considered grooming a logistics problem rather than an aesthetic one. The silver threading his temples had arrived early, the way it always does on men who carry weight that would kill most people. His dress uniform was immaculate and entirely wrong for the occasion. Too severe, too stripped of ornament, the medals and honorifics conspicuously absent in a room where every other decorated chest gleamed like a display case. His eyes were the thing that stopped people, not because they were damaged, though the faint scarring at the outer corners told the story clearly enough to anyone who knew what blast radius did to human tissue, but because they were open, fully open. Focused somewhere that wasn't this room, and perhaps wasn't this decade. Silver gray, the color of winter rivers just before they ice over, and behind them, the particular quality of attention that belongs only to people who learn to see without using their eyes. He was watching everyone in the room, through the floor, through the air, through the particular frequencies of sound and heat and movement that had replaced vision years ago and sharpened, in the absence of the original sense, into something that made his aides deeply uncomfortable and his enemies considerably more so. Lucien d'Arquent could not see the woman he had married 3 hours ago, but he had been tracking her position in the room since the reception began, and he knew, with the precision of a man who had learned to navigate entirely by consequence, exactly where she was standing right now. 42 feet, 2 o'clock, near the eastern windows where the draft from the gardens carried the faint scent of the jasmine trellises that climbed the exterior walls of the palace. She had been standing there for 20 minutes, which meant she was either deeply engaged in conversation or desperately avoiding something. Based on the quality of the silences that kept happening in that quadrant of the room, the social silences, the ones that meant someone was saying something that required careful response, he suspected the latter. He picked up his wine glass, took a single sip, and set it back down. A footman appeared at his elbow within 4 seconds. "Your Grace." "The woman by the eastern windows," Lucien said. His voice was the kind of low that carried anyway, the architectural quality of rooms designed for command. "Has she eaten anything?" A pause. The footman's breathing changed slightly. The micro-hesitation of someone recalibrating their understanding of what was being asked of them. I'm not certain, Your Grace. Find out. He paused. Discreetly. The footman departed. Lucien returned to his stillness. 42 feet, 2 o'clock. The jasmine was stronger now, which meant the wind had shifted, which meant she was closer. Serafina Vale Darkent, as of 3 hours and 17 minutes ago, was holding a glass of champagne she had not drunk and smiling at Countess Elara Voss with an expression she had practiced so extensively it no longer required conscious effort to maintain. You look radiant, the Countess was saying, which was the 4th time someone had used that particular word this evening, and the 3rd time they had deployed it with the exact inflection that meant considering everything. It's remarkable you're upright. The gown is exceptional. Madame Solène? Madame Devoe, Serafina said. She worked from a sketch I provided. How hands-on of you. The Countess's smile did not waver. Neither did her appraisal, which was doing the thing that aristocratic eyes did, assessing value and finding, or not finding, the corresponding entry in some internal ledger. I imagine the preparation for this evening must have been overwhelming. Thorough, Serafina said pleasantly. The gown was ivory silk overlaid with silver threadwork that caught the candlelight and turned it into something that moved when she moved, which had been the point. In a room designed to be a theater of power, presentation was armor. She had learned that lesson young and applied it without sentiment. Her dark hair was dressed high, the kind of architectural arrangement that took 3 hours and 4 additional people and communicated, in the silent language of imperial court fashion, that the wearer had both the resources and the patience for that level of investment. Pearl drops at her ears, a single strand at her throat, simple enough to read as understated, significant enough to read as deliberate. She looked in every measurable external way like exactly what she was supposed to be. A Vale daughter, adequately distinguished, adequately beautiful, delivered on schedule to the political arrangement her house had spent 18 months negotiating. Inside the elegant architecture of her presentation, Serafina was conducting a completely different and significantly more urgent calculus. The exits were behind her and to the left. The family delegation from House Vale was clustered near the head table, her mother, pale and fixed, 2 cousins managing the performance of celebration with varying degrees of success, and her father's chair conspicuously empty. Her father, Lord Aldrich Vale, had attended the ceremony. He had walked her down the aisle with the particular quality of stillness that she had spent 23 years learning to read correctly. Not pride, not grief. The stillness of a man accounting for variables. He had left the reception within 40 minutes of its beginning, citing a correspondence that required immediate attention, and no one with any understanding of House Vale's current political position would have found that explanation believable, but no one with any survival instinct would have said so out loud. Serafina had watched him go and felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the draft from the eastern windows. She was still feeling it now. The Duke seems... Countess Voss paused, selecting her word with the care of someone navigating a minefield she had mostly mapped. Composed. He generally is, Serafina said. You've spent time with him before the engagement formalized? The question was dressed as curiosity and meant as reconnaissance. The entire room had been conducting reconnaissance on her since the moment she arrived. How she stood near him, how she responded when he spoke, whether there was any legible warmth in the geography of her body when she occupied the same space as the blind Duke. The aristocracy was reading the marriage the way it read all political arrangements, for indications of where the actual power was residing and how rapidly it was likely to shift. Some, Serafina said, which was technically accurate and entirely misleading, and smiled at the Countess in a way that communicated she had answered the question. She had not spent time with Lucien Darkent before the engagement formalized. She had spent the weeks prior to the ceremony managing the particular kind of dread that arrives when you know something is coming and cannot determine how to either stop it or survive it. The meetings that had occurred, 3, all formal, all conducted in the presence of legal representatives and house advisors, had been brief and precise, the way everything Lucien did was brief and precise, and had told her almost nothing about the man except that he was considerably more contained than his reputation suggested, which was, if anything, more frightening. The rumors she could catalog against reality. The silence was harder to measure. He asked for a dance, she said, before she'd decided to say it. The Countess's carefully managed expression did something involuntary for exactly 1 second. I'm sorry? Earlier, before the reception, during the receiving line, he leaned over and said he'd like a dance before the evening ended. Serafina lifted her champagne glass and looked at it rather than at the Countess. He was very, she paused, searching, specific about it. Specific how? He said before midnight. She set the glass down, which is either a romantic sentiment or a deadline, and I haven't determined which. Countess Voss made a sound that might have been a laugh in a room where laughing felt safer. Perhaps both. Perhaps, Serafina agreed. She did not say. The way he said it sounded like neither. It sounded like a man who had decided something and was informing her of the decision rather than requesting her participation. It sounded like the particular quality of voice that belongs to people who have spent so long operating in environments where hesitation kills that they have lost the social grammar for framing things as questions. She did not say, I've heard that voice before. She did not say, I have been standing 40 feet away from him all evening because I'm working up the courage to be in the same breathing space as a man I may have destroyed, and the jasmine from the garden is making it significantly worse. If you'll excuse me, she said instead, and moved toward the interior of the room with the composed, measured pace of a woman who had somewhere specific to be. She had nowhere specific to be. She was buying time, and she was running out of it, and the clock above the northern entrance read 11:43. The thing about a secret kept for 10 years is that it stops feeling like a secret and starts feeling like architecture. You build your life around it the way a city builds around a river. Not because the river is pleasant, but because it is there and permanent, and the consequences of forgetting it exists tend to be catastrophic. You learn which bridges are safe. You learn how close you can get to the edge without the current catching you. You learn eventually to stop looking at it directly, because looking at it directly reminds you of how much of what you are was built around something you can never tell anyone. Serafina had been 17 years old. The Civil War had been 3 months in, which meant it was past the point where anyone with information could still pretend the outcome was uncertain. The empire was bleeding along fracture lines that had existed for 40 years, and the men who had spent those 40 years profiting from the tension had finally decided the time to strike was now, and the particular flavor of that decision, the military tactics, the troop movements, the intelligence betrayals, bore her father's fingerprint so clearly that she had understood, even at 17, that there was no version of events where Lord Aldrich Vale emerged clean. She had not understood what to do with that knowledge. She had understood even less what to do when she found a wounded officer in the collapsed section of what used to be the Aldrin Chapel, 3 miles inside territory that House Vale had just sold to the opposing command. He'd been there for at least a day. She could tell by the quality of his breathing, shallow, compensated, the sound of a body working very hard to manage what was happening to it. The explosion that had taken the chapel's east wall had taken other things too, and the bandaging he'd managed on his own was adequate for someone who had nothing better available, which was an impressive assessment of a very bad situation. She had almost left. Not from cruelty. From the particular paralysis that arrives when the right action is obvious, and the cost of it is potentially everything. If she helped an imperial officer in territory her father controlled, and her father found out, there were outcomes that began with displacement and escalated quickly from there. If she left him there, he would die. That was also an outcome. She had not left. She didn't know his name for 2 days. He was conscious intermittently, feverish enough that his responses to her questions were unreliable, and she'd learned early in her childhood that you don't push sick people for information that isn't immediately medically relevant. She'd cleaned the wound, reset the bandaging properly, brought water and whatever food she could move from the chapel kitchen without her absence being noted, and sat in the dusty half-dark of the collapsed chapel, learning the particular skill of being very quiet in someone else's pain. On the 3rd day, his fever broke. He opened his eyes, silver gray, she'd noted, the color of winter rivers, and said, with the careful diction of a man ensuring his faculties were intact, "How long have I been here?" 3 days, she'd said. A pause. You've been here the entire time? Someone had to be. He'd looked at her for a long moment with the quality of attention she would not understand until much later, the kind that doesn't require vision so much as focus. Then he said, Lucien Darquin. Serafina Vale, she'd said, and watched his face do something complicated with her family name. Your father? I know what my father did, she'd said flatly. That's not why I'm here. He hadn't pushed. That was the first thing she'd noticed, that he heard a boundary and stopped at it, not from social compliance, but from the genuine understanding that information delivered under pressure is less reliable than information offered voluntarily. He'd asked her once, quietly, whether she was in danger by being here. She'd said yes, and he'd accepted that answer too. In the days that followed, 8 days total, before she could arrange transport to a loyalist line without leaving a traceable path, she had come to understand that Lucien Darquin, at 22, was almost nothing like the man his rank suggested. He was analytical in the way that felt like observation rather than calculation. He was honest with a bluntness she found disorienting after years of the layered language of noble households. He was angry, a deep contained anger at specific things, at specific people, at specific choices that had led to specific casualties, the kind of anger that never generalized into cruelty because it was too precisely targeted. He told her things she suspected he had never said out loud, in the particular freedom that exists between people who have agreed, without articulating it, that this space is outside the normal rules. She told him almost nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. On the 8th day, she'd arranged a route. She'd drawn it herself, memorized it, walked him through it twice. She'd pressed a folded note into his hand, coordinates, timing, the location of 3 loyalist safe positions, and when he'd reached for her wrist, she'd let him hold it for exactly 4 seconds before she said, You need to go now. Serafina, now, she said, before I can't make myself say it again. He had gone. She had gone too, in the other direction, and spent the following 6 months helping her mother quietly dismantle whatever was salvageable from House Vale's position while her father managed the consequences of backing a losing side. And she had put Lucien Darquin into the part of her mind reserved for things that were finished. Finished. Not forgotten. Those were different categories, and she had never confused them. She had heard, 3 months later, about the explosion in the Ardennes sector. She had read the imperial dispatches with the particular quality of attention she reserved for information she was not supposed to care about. She had understood, from the clinical language of the military assessment, what had happened to his eyes. She had not been able to eat for 2 days. She had not been able to look at Jasmine since. The clock read 11:51. Serafina was standing near the refreshment table on the western side of the ballroom, engaged in a conversation about agricultural reform that she was conducting on autopilot while the rest of her attention tracked the room the way it always did in high-stakes environments. Exits, positions, the particular geometry of who was watching whom and what quality of attention they were deploying. She knew exactly where he was. She had known exactly where he was for the past 4 hours, which she recognized as the behavioral residue of someone who had learned, in an 8-day crash course a decade ago, that keeping accurate track of Lucien Darquin's location was a matter of significant consequence. He was standing at the edge of the dance floor now. He had not danced. He had spoken to perhaps 6 people, briefly, and each conversation had ended with the other person leaving with the careful pace of someone who had received information they needed to process privately. He was facing in her direction. She knew he couldn't see her. She knew that. The medical reality was not ambiguous, and yet the quality of his stillness, the exact particular orientation of a man who had learned to navigate entirely by other means, communicated something that her nervous system was reading as being seen. She excused herself from the agricultural conversation and moved toward the door to the side gallery, not quickly enough to read as flight, quickly enough to read as purposeful. She made it 8 feet. Duchess. His voice came from her left, which meant he'd moved some time in the past 4 minutes without her noticing, which meant she'd been managing her own anxiety badly enough to lose track of him, which was a failure she noted clinically even as her body was busy doing something unhelpful with her heart rate. She turned. He was standing 3 feet away. He had closed the distance between his previous position and her current one in a ballroom full of 400 people without touching a single one of them, which was either remarkable spatial memory or something she didn't have a clean clinical category for. Up close, the scarring at his temples was more visible. The dress uniform was precisely pressed, severe, the rank insignia carrying the weight of campaigns that were not decorative. He was holding a glass he hadn't been drinking from, and his face was doing the thing it did. The careful, absolute stillness of a man who had replaced a sense with something else entirely. "You were about to leave," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was going to the gallery," she said. "You were going to the gallery to avoid this conversation." A pause. "Which is a reasonable strategy." She measured him. "You were watching me." "I've been tracking your position for 4 hours." He said it the way he said everything, with the flat precision of a man who had discarded the social grammar around stating things directly. "You've eaten nothing. You've been standing near the eastern windows for most of the evening because the draft from the garden is consistent and predictable things are easier to manage than a room full of variables." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man processing incoming data. "You're good in crowds, but you need a wall at your back when you're in them." Serafina said nothing. "I asked for a dance," he said, "before midnight." "It's—" She checked the clock. 11:54. "Yes." She looked at him for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. The jasmine draft from the eastern windows was moving through the ballroom on the same shift in the wind that had been occurring every 40 minutes with the consistency she had, he was correct, been using as an orientation point. It reached them. She watched something happen in his face. It was not large. It was not legible to anyone more than 2 feet away. It was the quality of change that passes over a person when something they had catalogued as closed suddenly opens. A reorientation, a recalculation. The particular micro-expression of a man who has just received information that is rearranging the structure of what he understood to be true. His stillness changed, not physically. The external architecture was identical. Same posture, same angle, same flat economy of movement. But the quality of it shifted from the composed stillness of a man at a reception he was managing to something else entirely. The stillness of a man standing very carefully at the edge of something he needed to confirm before he moved. "Give me your hand," he said. His voice was different, still low, still carrying the same architectural quality of command. But something had entered it that hadn't been there before. Not warmth exactly, and not softness, because those were the wrong categories. The quality of someone who has been very cold for a very long time, standing in a draft that smells exactly like something they had decided to stop looking for. Serafina said, "We don't have to. Give me your hand." She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with the care of a man handling something he was not certain was real. Not gentle. That wasn't the right word either. Precise. The way you close your fingers around an object in the dark to confirm its dimensions before you allow yourself to believe it's what you think it is. He went very still, completely still. The kind that clears a room without clearing it. The kind that makes the people nearest to them step back by 2 feet without consciously deciding to, because something in the atmosphere has changed and the body knows it before the mind has finished the sentence. He turned her hand over. His thumb moved to the inside of her wrist, and she understood from the nature of that touch that he was not taking her pulse but mapping something, running a reference against a remembered impression, the way a blind man does when a shape fits against a shape he'd filed somewhere he'd thought was permanently closed. "There was a girl," he said. His voice had dropped. It wasn't quiet. It was the opposite of quiet. It was the particular quality of low that carries further than a raised voice because the body recognizes it as something that matters. "There was a girl in an abandoned chapel in the 3rd month of a war I was losing." His thumb had stopped moving. "She sat with me for 8 days and didn't tell me her name for 2 of them, and she smelled like jasmine, and she put a map in my hand and told me I had to go." The ballroom was enormous, 400 people. An orchestra in the gallery above still playing, the chandeliers burning with the particular excess of imperial wealth on display. Serafina could hear none of it. "She disappeared after that," Lucienne continued. "I looked. Afterward, when I had resources to look, I looked for a long time. A pause so measured it had its own weight. I thought she was dead. He raised his head. He could not see her face, but she had the absolute and unambiguous certainty that it made no difference. Say something, he said, and his voice had shed something in the last 10 seconds. Not the command quality. That was structural. It would not shed. But the construction that sat over the command quality, the one that performed composure, the one that had been performing composure for 10 years in rooms where composure was survival, that was gone. What was underneath it was not soft. What was underneath it was the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something at full load for a decade and has just received the information that the thing he was carrying was not finished after all. Serafina said, "Lucien, your hand is shaking," he said. "I know. Is it fear?" She looked at him, at the silver-gray eyes that were open and not seeing and seeing everything anyway, at the careful devastation happening in the architecture of his face, at the man who had been a wounded officer in a ruined chapel and was now the most feared person in the imperial court and was standing in the middle of his own wedding reception holding her hand like it was the first real thing he had touched in years. "Yes," she said. "Of me?" A pause. "Of this." Something moved in his face. Not the expression of a man who had received the answer he hoped for. The expression of a man who had received the answer he expected and found that it confirmed something he was not yet done being angry about. "There are things you didn't tell me," he said. "Yes." "About your father." The word landed between them like weight dropped from height. Serafina's hand stopped shaking, not because she'd stopped being afraid, because the particular quality of dread that arrives when the thing you have been fearing is no longer approaching, but is finally, definitively here, that dread doesn't shake. It settles. It becomes very, very still. "Lucien," she said. "There are things you knew," he said, and his voice was careful now, in a way that was not the same as composed, about what was being planned. In the 3rd month of the war, about the location of my regiment, about the road the supply lines were using. He had not released her hand. And the chapel, he continued, was 3 miles inside Vale territory, which means someone put you there. Or, he paused, and the pause was doing something terrible. You put yourself there. And I've spent 10 years with one of those 2 answers and no way to determine which one it was. Lucien, the explosion in the Ardennes was 3 months after the chapel. His thumb moved again on her wrist, deliberate, finding the pulse point she hadn't been able to conceal. A supply road that 3 people knew, and 2 of them were Imperial Command. The 3rd was someone in a position to give that information to whoever built the device. A beat. "I know what your father did. I've known for 8 years. What I haven't known..." He stopped. The orchestra above them was playing something slow. 400 people in the ballroom, and the 6 nearest to them had all shifted their positions in the past 30 seconds without seeming to notice they had done it. "What I haven't known," he said, and his voice had gone to a register that was not anger and was not grief and was something older than both of them, "is whether the girl who saved my life knew what came after it." The jasmine came through again on the Eastern draft. Serafina looked at the man who was her husband, who was the most dangerous person she had ever stood next to, who was holding her hand with the precise, careful pressure of someone who had not yet decided what he was holding, and she understood with the clarity that only arrives at the absolute end of something that there was no answer she could give him in the next 60 seconds that would not cost her everything. The wrong answer would cost her everything at once. The right answer would cost her everything slowly. But his eyes, open, silver gray, focused on something that was not her face but was absolutely, undeniably her, were asking for the right answer. Not asking, requiring. The way he required everything, without the linguistic framing of a request, because the request was the wrong form for what he was actually doing, which was making it clear that he already knew and was giving her the choice of whether to tell him the truth before or after he stopped giving her choices. She opened her mouth. The clock above the northern entrance began to strike midnight. She watched something go through him, the intake of breath, barely visible, the micro-adjustment of a man recalibrating the moment, and she understood that whatever she was about to say would define the structure of everything that came after it. and that the Empire's most feared man was holding the hand of the woman who had sat with him for 8 days and then walked him to the door of a war and said, "Go," and that he had spent 10 years looking for her, and that the jasmine was everywhere, and that she was completely, irreversibly out of time. She said, "I knew." The midnight bell rang. The ballroom erupted with the orchestrated celebration of the hour. The guests raising their glasses, the lights shifting to the warm gold of the program's celebration sequence, the orchestra transitioning into the triumphant midnight piece the event coordinator had arranged 6 months ago for exactly this moment. And in the middle of it all, in the noise and the gold and the 400 people lifting their glasses to the health of the blind duke and his new bride, Lucien Darkent went absolutely, completely, catastrophically still. His hand did not release hers. It held. The midnight bell finished its count. 12 strokes. The last one dissolved into the ballroom noise the way all finalities do, absorbed by the larger sound of people who didn't know anything had ended. Lucien had not moved. His hand still held hers. Not gripping. That would have been easier to read. Holding, with the specific pressure of a man who has received information and is deciding what to do with it before he does anything at all. The distinction mattered. Serafina understood it the way you understand the difference between a door being locked and a door being held shut from the other side. "You knew," he said. Not a question. He was repeating it back the way someone repeats a word in a foreign language they've been told the translation for, testing the shape of it against the meaning, making sure both were real. "Yes," she said. Around them, the celebration swelled and peaked and began its natural recession, the guests settling back into their clusters, the orchestra transitioning into something slower, the footmen circulating with fresh glasses. The world continuing to operate on the assumption that nothing of consequence was happening in this particular square footage of the ballroom. "How much?" he said. "Lucien, how much did you know?" His voice was flat. The flatness wasn't emptiness. It was load-bearing, the verbal equivalent of a structure holding considerably more weight than its surface suggested. "Before the chapel, before you found me." She made herself hold his gaze. His eyes weren't focused on her face. They never focused on faces the way sighted people did. They focused somewhere slightly past or through, the orientation of a man who had built a complete alternative system for reading the world. But the quality of attention behind them was the most precise thing in the room. "I knew there was an operation," she said carefully. "I didn't know the specific target. But you knew the sector. A beat. Yes. And the road." She didn't answer fast enough. "Serafina." The way he said her name had changed in the last 4 minutes. Before, in the receiving line, in the brief formal exchanges of the ceremony, her name in his mouth had been a title. Correct, precisely delivered, stripped of implication. Now it had weight behind it. The weight of 8 days in a ruined chapel and a decade of absence and 2 specific questions she could feel him holding like surgical instruments, deciding which one to use first. "The supply road. Did you know about the supply road?" "Not from my father directly." "But you knew." "I inferred," she said, "from things I overheard, fragments. I was 17 and I was trying to—" She stopped, felt the inadequacy of the sentence before she finished it. "To protect your family," he said. Not with contempt, worse than contempt, with comprehension. The specific comprehension of a man who understood survival math and had been on the losing end of someone else's calculation of it. "You were trying to protect your family, and that meant staying quiet about what was coming." "Yes." He released her hand, not dramatically, with the clean economy of a man completing an action that no longer served its purpose. His fingers simply stopped holding hers and moved to his side, and the absence of that contact was considerably louder than anything happening in the rest of the room. "I need air," he said, which was not what she expected. He moved. She watched him cross the ballroom the way he always crossed spaces. The particular navigational fluency of a man who had mapped every room he entered within the first 3 minutes of entering it, who used sound and air pressure and the vibrations of floor beneath formal shoes to build a spatial model that was, apparently, accurate enough to bring him from one side of a crowded ballroom to a side door without touching a single person or hesitating once. She stood there for 4 seconds. Then she followed him. Oops. The east terrace ran the length of the palace's garden-facing wall. Broad stone flags and balustrade and the jasmine trellises that climbed the exterior in trained columns, released now in the warm night air. The garden below was lit with lanterns positioned along the walking paths, the effect elegant and deliberate, designed by someone who understood that wealth looks best when it appears effortless. Lucien was standing at the balustrade. His hands were on the stone. His back was to the door, and he didn't turn when she came through it, which meant he'd tracked the sound of it opening and had already identified it as her before he needed to address it. That was the thing about him she'd forgotten in the decade of managed distance. The thing that had taken 3 days in the chapel to understand. He was never not paying attention. He had simply, at some point, learned to make the pain of attention invisible, because visible attention in his world meant exposed position, and exposed position was the last thing you wanted. The jasmine was very strong out here. He said, without turning, "How long have you known the engagement was to me specifically?" 4 months, she said, when the houses began formal negotiation. And before that, when you heard it was Darquin. She came to the balustrade, not next to him, 6 feet down, which kept them both at the railing, parallel, which was easier than facing each other in the open dark. 3 weeks before you were told. So you had 3 weeks to withdraw. He turned his head slightly, not toward her. The calculation was off for visual orientation, but the quality of it was unmistakable. You didn't. My father... I'm not asking about your father. A pause. The kind that costs something to hold. I'm asking about you. The question sat between them. Serafina looked at the garden lanterns below. A pair of guests had come out onto the lower terrace. She could hear the low murmur of their conversation, the clink of glasses, entirely unaware of what was happening 20 feet above and to the right of them. I thought... She started and started again. I thought if it was just political, if it was an arrangement with someone who wouldn't look too closely, who had enough power to not need anything from me beyond the formal requirements, you thought you could manage it. Yes. And you thought I wouldn't recognize you. The quiet that followed that sentence had a different quality than the ones before it. Those had been the silence of a man controlling something. This one was something working loose. You were blinded, she said, and heard the inadequacy of it the moment it left her. He didn't respond immediately. His hands were still on the stone, the pressure of them visible even in the low light. Not the white-knuckled pressure of suppressed rage, but the steady, deliberate pressure of a man using something solid to anchor himself to the present moment while he managed what was happening in all the other moments simultaneously. Yes, he said finally. I was blinded. Another pause. I wasn't made stupid. I know. I've been tracking your voice for 4 hours. He turned then, fully, and the quality of his attention across 6 feet of terrace was the same quality it had been in the ballroom. The focused, precise orientation of a man who saw through different instruments. The way you modulate it in crowds versus in smaller spaces. The particular rhythm you use when you're managing a conversation versus when you're actually in one. I've been building a profile since the reception line. A beat. I knew within 40 minutes. Serafina said nothing. I wanted to see, he continued, whether you would come to me, or whether you'd run the full length of the evening and make me come to you. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite anything she had a clean name for. You almost made it. I wasn't running. You were absolutely running. He said it without judgment, which was in some ways worse. The clinical accuracy of a man describing a factual condition. You were running, and you were very good at it, and you would have made it past midnight if I'd let you. You had an exit strategy. I watched you triangulate it 3 times from the eastern windows. He paused. What was it? The gallery route to the north corridor, or the servants' passage behind the east column? She stared at him. North corridor, she said. He made a sound that was almost something. I would have gone east column, less traffic after 11. She felt something shift inside her chest, the internal structural equivalent of a wall bearing weight it wasn't built for, finding an unexpected point of contact with the thing pushing against it. Not comfort, not warmth. The specific quality of 2 people who are built similarly recognizing each other in the middle of a disaster, neither of them has finished calculating. She killed it. She didn't have the luxury of it. What do you want from me? She said. Not combative, direct. The same directness she'd used in the chapel because it was the only currency he'd ever accepted. Tell me what you want. Not what you're deciding, what you actually want. The question landed in the night air and the jasmine and the distant murmur of the guests below. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, an accounting of what I knew, of what you knew, when you knew it, what you chose and why. He moved away from the balustrade one step, which brought the distance between them to 4 feet and changed the spatial quality of the conversation from parallel to something else. Not a confession. I don't want a confession. Confession is for people who need to feel absolved. His voice had stripped further. The last of the formal register was gone, and what was underneath it was the voice she remembered from the chapel. The voice that didn't perform anything because it was operating in an environment where performance cost more than it bought. I want the facts, in order, starting from what you heard and when. And then I'll decide what we do with them. The phrasing of it, what we do with them, landed in a way she hadn't expected. Not what I do. Not what I do to you. The plural possessive that implied a shared problem, a shared space, a shared trajectory forward through whatever the facts turned out to constitute. She understood, in that moment, that he had already made a decision she didn't have access to yet. That the accounting he was asking for was not the precondition to a verdict, but the precondition to a strategy. That the man standing 4 feet from her in the jasmine dark had spent 10 years operating in environments where information was more valuable than punishment, and had not, despite everything, led with destruction. Which was either the most frightening thing she'd learned about him in the last 20 minutes, or the most important. All right, she said. She told him. Not everything, not the full architecture of it, not the names and the dates and the specific fragments of overheard conversation that had assembled themselves in her 17-year-old mind into a picture she hadn't known what to do with. That would take longer than a terrace and a wedding night. But the shape of it, the essential shape, what she had known and when, and the specific calculus she had been running when she put herself in the path of a wounded imperial officer and made the choice to stay. He listened the way he always had, completely, without interrupting, without the social signals that most people deploy to indicate they're processing what you're saying, the small affirmations and expressions that perform comprehension. He was simply there, in the particular way he was there, taking in information and placing it into whatever architecture he was building with it. When she finished, the garden below had gone quiet. The guests had moved back inside. Your father knew you were there, he said. It wasn't a question. Not at first, later, after you were gone. He didn't know who I'd been helping. I don't think he knew until much later. How much later? She met the direction of his attention. Recently, she said carefully, something crystallized in his face. He's not at the reception, Lucicienne said. No? He left within 40 minutes of arrival. She hadn't known he'd tracked that. She should have assumed he had. Yes. And he knew the engagement was being finalized to me for how long? The same 3 weeks I knew. He went very still again. The specific quality of stillness that she was learning to read, not as absence of activity, but as the opposite. All of the activity consolidated, directed, the external motionlessness of a man whose internal machinery was running at full capacity. He placed you there, Lucian said. 10 years ago, in the chapel. He placed you there. Not louder, more certain. The distinction between raising a voice and simply refusing to entertain an alternative. He was running an intelligence asset in his own household. 17 years old, in the right last name, and a wounded officer who needed care long enough to lower his guard. His jaw had tightened by a fraction. Confirmation of survival, location, whatever I said in 8 days of fever that could be used to map command movement afterward. The words hit the place she had spent 10 years building walls around. I didn't report anything. I know you didn't. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was not soft. I know that because I'm still alive, and because the intelligence reports from that period don't match anything you would have been in a position to overhear. He paused. But he put you there believing you would. And when you didn't, another pause, calculating something. The Ardennes explosion was sourced from a different asset, which means when you went silent, he moved to a contingency. The jasmine moved on the night air. Serafina was very aware of her own breathing. She had known this, somewhere below the level of things she was willing to fully examine. She had known the shape of it the way you know the shape of something you've been carefully not looking at for a decade, through peripheral evidence and deliberate avoidance and the specific quality of her father's expression on the morning he'd asked her what she'd been doing in the east quarter of the estate for those 9 days. And she'd said nothing, and he'd looked at her with something that was not parental concern. "He put you there," Lucian said again, quieter. "And now he's put you here." The air between them had changed. Not warmer. That wasn't the right word. Denser. The quality of two people who have arrived at the same point from opposite directions and found themselves occupying the same square footage of an understanding neither of them had fully wanted to reach. "What does he want?" Lucian said. It wasn't directed at her exactly, more at the space between them, at the shape of the problem assembling itself in the jasmine dark. From this marriage, specifically, not the political cover, not the house reconciliation. What does he need from being inside darkened proximity? Serafina's voice came out level because she made it. There are documents that could link certain decisions during the war, specific intelligence transfers, to specific names. Those documents have been moving through a collector's circuit for 2 years. They're expected to surface before the next imperial session. The silence that followed had a different weight than the ones before. "He needs me to make them disappear," Lucien said, "or to make their contents irrelevant. If dearcant influence is applied before they surface, he used you to access me." So the flatness was back, the load-bearing flatness, and underneath it something that had no clean name but was large and old and had been kept in a specific shape by a decade of careful management. 10 years ago and again now, the same instrument, twice. She couldn't give him anything useful to say to that, so she said nothing. He turned back to the balustrade. His hands went back to the stone. The quality of his stillness had shifted for the 3rd time tonight, past the composure of the reception, past the careful precision of the terrace conversation, into something that was operating from a different level entirely. The level where decisions get made that don't get unmade. "Go back inside," he said. "Lucien, go back inside, Serafina." He paused. "I need to think, and I need you not to be standing next to the jasmine while I do it." She looked at his back, at the severe line of the dress uniform, and the hands on the stone, and the particular quality of a man who had been an instrument of other people's wars long enough to recognize the architecture of being deployed, and had just discovered the woman he'd spent 10 years looking for was the delivery mechanism. She went back inside. She made it to the interior corridor before her hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against the cold wall and held them there and looked down the long corridor toward the sounds of the reception, the music and the conversation, and the Empire celebrating a marriage it had engineered for reasons that had just revealed a 3rd layer she hadn't known was there. Behind her, through the closed door, the terrace was quiet. And then she heard Lucien's voice, low, precise, the clip of a man issuing instruction to someone who had been waiting in the shadows of the terrace for exactly this moment. "Find out who Aldrich Vale has spoken to since he left the reception," he said. "Every name, every location, starting now." A pause. The brief silence of someone responding in a register too low for the door to carry. "And Kalen," Lucian said, and the quality of his voice had changed in a way that traveled through the closed door and the stone wall and the cold air of the corridor, and landed somewhere in the center of Serafina's chest, like the specific sound of a lock engaging. "Tell them the Duchess is not to be approached without my direct authorization. Anyone who tests that instruction." A pause that had its own complete sentence inside it. "Remind them what happened to the last person who tested my patience on a matter of personal concern." Silence. Then footsteps moving away into the garden dark. Serafina stood in the corridor with her hands flat against the cold wall and understood, with the clarity that arrives only at the point where there is no longer anything to do but understand, that she had just crossed into territory from which there was no navigating back. The marriage she had agreed to manage from a distance had just become something else entirely, and the man she had married, the Empire's most feared instrument of ruin, had just aimed himself, with the complete and total precision she remembered from a chapel 10 years ago, directly at her father. 3 weeks into the marriage, Serafina learned the precise dimensions of what it meant to live inside Lucien d'Arcant's protection. It was not comfortable. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed the way fortifications are designed, for function, for durability, for the specific purpose of making certain categories of harm geometrically impossible. The staff of D'Arcant Palace moved around her with the careful deference of people who had received instruction and understood the consequences of misapplying it. Her correspondence was handled through the palace secretary, but never opened without her presence. Her movements within the estate were entirely her own. Her movements outside it required not permission, but company. Always one of Lucien's personal guard. Always someone who reported back not her location, but her safety status, which was a distinction he had made explicitly, and she had spent 2 days deciding what to do with. She had decided to accept it, not from compliance, from the recognition that the man who had issued those quiet, absolute instructions on the terrace was operating from a threat assessment she didn't have the full picture of yet, and arguing against a security architecture before you understood what it was securing against was the kind of mistake that people in her position couldn't afford to make twice. They were not warm with each other. That would have been the wrong word. They were careful. Careful in the way that people are careful when they are holding something fragile and expensive and not yet certain whether it belongs to them. He came to dinner. He asked precise questions about her day that were not small talk. They were data collection, the same data collection he applied to everything, and she had stopped finding it impersonal after the first week when she realized it was the opposite of impersonal. It was the most personal form of attention she had ever been subject to, the kind that actually retained what you said and cross-referenced it against what you said the following evening and noted, without comment, the discrepancies. She started being more precise. He noticed that too. The documents her father needed to neutralize were, according to Lucien's intelligence sources, currently in the possession of a collector named Vero Essian, a minor noble with significant antiquarian interests and even more significant connections to 3 of the houses currently operating in the anti-D'Arcant coalition. Lucien had told her this on the 4th day, sitting across the breakfast table with the same quality of directness he applied to everything. Here is the problem. Here are its current coordinates. Here is what I know and what I don't. She had asked why he was telling her. Because it concerns your family, he said, and because you're better informed about your father's operating methods than anyone in my intelligence network. A pause. And because I don't keep relevant information from people who are inside my perimeter. She had absorbed that. I'm inside your perimeter. You're my wife, he said, which was not the same answer but contained it. What she had not told him yet, what she was still assembling the courage to tell him, was the specific content of the most recent letter from her father. The letter that had arrived 8 days ago through a channel that should not have existed inside D'Arcant Palace, through a channel that meant someone on the inside of Lucien's household was passing correspondence that Lucien's own security architecture was designed to intercept. Someone close enough to the inner operation to know exactly which gaps to use. She had the letter. She had read it 4 times. She had not burned it yet because she was still trying to determine whether the information in it was a warning or a weapon, and until she knew which one it was, she couldn't decide what to do with it. Her father wanted the Essian documents neutralized within 30 days. The letter did not specify what happened if they weren't. It didn't need to. Lord Aldrich Vale had been making himself understood without completing his sentences since before she could read. The 30 days were at 22 when Caelan Voss, Lucien's steward, his most trusted operational advisor, the man who had managed the intelligence network of D'Arcant interests for 11 years, knocked on the door of the East Study where she was working and asked to speak with her privately. Marcel. Caelan Voss was 43, with the lean, weathered quality of a man who had spent significant portions of his career in places that were not designed for long-term human habitation. He had gray at his temples and careful eyes, and the particular quality of stillness that Serafina had, in the weeks since her arrival, associated with people who operated in Lucien's immediate circle, the stillness of people who had learned, from extended proximity to that level of precision, to run their own internal calibration at a higher standard than the general population. She had liked him. That was the thing she would return to afterward, in the particular way you return to the thing that most clearly demonstrates your own blind spots. She had liked him, had found his intelligence and his quiet competence reassuring in a household that was otherwise navigating her with the careful uncertainty of people managing an unfamiliar variable. He had been the one consistent point of warmth in the formal machinery of the palace's operation. She should have recognized that as a tool. She knew from her father's methodology that warmth is most useful when it's deployed as access. "Your Grace," he said, and closed the study door, and the quality of his entry, too deliberate, the door closed too completely, registered in the back of her mind as a variable before she had consciously named it. "Kaylin?" She set down the correspondence she was reviewing. "What is it?" He sat across from her without being invited to, which was the second variable. "I need to speak with you about Lord Vale," he said. She kept her expression even. "All right. He's contacted me." A pause that had its own structure inside it. "Directly. 3 weeks ago and again last week." The room temperature did not change. Her perception of it did. "He contacted you," she said. "He's been building a file." Kaylin's voice was careful. Not the care of a man protecting someone, but the care of a man delivering something he had prepared. "On the Duke, specifically on the Ardennes campaign decisions and the post-war intelligence operations. Enough to bring formal charges before the Imperial Council if it's presented with the right supporting testimony." He paused. "He's asking for my testimony." She looked at him for a long moment. "And what did you tell him?" she said. "I told him I needed time to consider." He met her gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who had made a decision before entering the room. "I'm telling you now because I want you to understand the position you're in. Lord Vale believes the Duke's current political trajectory will destroy your family completely if left unchecked. He's not wrong about the trajectory." Another pause. "He's offering House Vale's survival in exchange for the right evidence placed with the right people." Serafina said nothing. The letter. The channel that shouldn't exist. 22 days out of 30. "You've already decided," she said. Not a question. Something shifted in Kaylin's expression. Not remorse. She would have been able to work with remorse. The shift of a man recalibrating slightly in response to a target that was not behaving according to projection. "I've decided to give you the opportunity to make a choice before events overtake it," he said. "The Duke trusts you. More than I expected. More than is strategically sound, frankly, given what you told him on the terrace." He paused. "If you support the testimony, if you confirm the version of events your father's legal team has assembled, your presence during the war, your direct knowledge of the supply road, your awareness of what happened in the Ardennes." "I was 17 years old," she said. "Your testimony would confirm the intelligence failure originated with Darkent command decisions, not with any external party." His voice stayed careful, stayed warm. The warmth was doing the thing it had been designed to do, and she could feel it and could not entirely stop responding to it, which was the most disgusting part. "The Duke survives. Diminished, yes. Politically damaged, yes. But alive and protected from the more serious implications. And my father gets immunity. Your father gets to continue existing in the Empire," he paused, "which is what you've been protecting for 23 years. The study was quiet. Outside the window, the Darkent grounds ran to the formal gardens and then the wall, and beyond the wall, the city. And in the city somewhere, the documents that had been moving through the collector's circuit for 2 years and were apparently not the actual weapon at all. The actual weapon was sitting across from her in a chair she had watched Lucian occupy 100 times in the past 3 weeks, deployed with the patience of someone who had been positioned and waiting for exactly this moment. She understood, with the specific quality of comprehension that arrives only when you are standing directly inside the thing you failed to see, that the household breach hadn't been her father finding a gap in the security architecture. Her father had built the gap 11 years ago when he helped finance the early Darkent intelligence network. When he recommended a particular candidate for the position of household steward to a young duke who was still building his operation and trusted his advisor's judgment about personnel. Kaylin Voss had been her father's placement from the beginning. 11 years. Inside Lucian's closest operational circle. She felt something move through her that was not anger yet. It was below anger, the precursor to it, the specific quality of cold that arrives when the architecture of a betrayal reveals its full dimensions and the mind needs several seconds to scale itself to the size of what it's seen. "You've been his asset since the beginning," she said. Kaelin didn't deny it. That was almost a form of respect. "I've managed my relationship with Lord Vale carefully. The Duke has been well served by my work. That's not contradicted by the existence of a secondary arrangement. You helped build the intelligence network that's been investigating my father for 8 months. Selectively," he said. "The investigation has been productive in ways that serve darkened interests. It simply hasn't reached certain conclusions." She looked at him, at the careful eyes and the lean, weathered face, and the quality of stillness she had mistaken for competence, when it was actually the stillness of a man who had been running a performance long enough that it had become structural. "What happens," she said, "if I tell him?" "Then Lord Vale presents the file to the Imperial Council within 72 hours. His voice didn't change. "The testimony is submitted by 3 corroborating sources who don't require your participation. The Duke faces a formal inquiry during which his political position becomes significantly more vulnerable than it is now." He paused. "And your father ensures that your specific knowledge of the supply road becomes part of the public record, not as a child protecting her family, as a Vale asset who maintained her cover for 8 days and delivered an Imperial officer's field intelligence to House Command." The cold had finished becoming anger. She could feel it now. Not the hot, reactive kind, but the specific cold anger that arrives when something has been done to someone you had not finished deciding you were protecting, and you find that the decision has been made for you by the person who did the damage. "He'd destroy me to protect himself," she said. "He'd use every instrument available to protect his survival," Kaelin said. "He always has. You know that." She did know that. She had always known that. The letter, the warmth, the channel through the household steward who had been her father's instrument 11 years before she arrived. All of it assembled and patient and waiting for exactly the moment when she was close enough to Lucien d'Arquent to be useful. And when the 30 days ran out and the documents surfaced regardless, and her father needed something more reliable than a neutralized file. He needed Lucien damaged, and he needed her to be the one who did it. "I need 24 hours, she said. Kaelin studied her. "For what purpose?" "Because you came to me with a choice, and I'm exercising it." Her voice had gone flat in a way she recognized from the chapel. The flatness that arrives when the performance cost becomes too high and what's underneath it has stopped waiting to be managed. 24 hours. Or the alternative you've described begins immediately, and we find out what Lucien d'Arquent does to people who build 11 years of access inside his household and then use it against him. A pause. "That's not a small threat," Kaelin said. "I know exactly how large it is," she said. 24 hours. He stood, straightened his jacket with the precision of a man who maintained his external architecture regardless of what the conversation had just cost. "Tomorrow evening," he said. "I'll need your answer by the dinner hour." He left. She sat in the study for 6 minutes and 40 seconds by the clock on the east wall, which was long enough to finish the accounting she'd been running since the first variable, which was long enough to understand that the choice in front of her was not between protecting Lucien and protecting her father. Her father had already made that choice. The choice in front of her was between protecting Lucien and protecting herself, the version of herself that was implicated, the version with the supply road and the 8 days, and the specific knowledge that could be reframed by a skilled legal team with 3 corroborating sources into something that ended in formal charges rather than historical footnote. It was a real threat. She had to give it that. Her father had not survived 20 years of imperial politics by underestimating the leverage he needed to move a target. She stood, pressed her hands flat on the desk surface for 1 second. Then she walked out of the study, through the east corridor, past the formal reception rooms and the portrait gallery and the main staircase, toward the wing of the palace where Lucien spent his working hours. She found him in the war chamber. The war chamber was not a room that people entered without invitation, and she had not been invited. The guard outside it, Wren, who she knew well enough by now to read his default expression, moved to intercept and then stopped, because Lucien's voice came through the closed door saying, "Let her in," which meant he'd heard her footsteps in the corridor and identified them before she reached the door, and she was no longer startled by this. She pushed the door open. The war chamber was long and narrow, with the topographical maps on the walls and the central table spread with the operational documents of whatever Lucien was currently running. He was standing at the table. Kaylin was not present. Two intelligence aides were, and they read her face and her pace across the room and were making their exit before Lucien had finished processing the first 2 seconds of her entry. The door closed behind them. She stopped on the opposite side of the central table. "Kaylin Voss," she said. Something happened in Lucien's face. A micro-movement. The same micro-movement she'd watched on their wedding night when the jasmine reached him. The quality of a man receiving information that is rearranging a structure he thought was settled. "What about him, Chet?" he said. "He came to me 40 minutes ago." She put both hands on the table surface. "He's been your father-in-law's asset for 11 years. He's been managing your intelligence operation with a selective brief, building your network while ensuring it never reached certain conclusions about certain people." She watched his face, watched the stillness arrive, the load-bearing kind. "My father has a file on your Ardennes decisions. Kaylin has been shaping the evidence that would support it. He wants my testimony to confirm a version of events that shifts the intelligence failure onto your command decisions and grants my father political immunity." Silence. Not the silence of surprise. Lucien's silences were never about surprise. He'd long since done the work of preparing for the versions of reality that most people refuse to consider until they were already inside them. This silence was the silence of a man confirming a shape he had suspected and not yet proved. "He told you this directly," Lucien said, "sitting across from me in the East Study. In your chair." Her voice was steady. The anger was steady under it, cold and load-bearing. "He gave me 24 hours to decide. And you're telling me now. I'm telling you now." The quality of his attention across the table had changed. She felt it the way you feel a shift in air pressure. Not visible, but physical, the body registering what the eyes couldn't confirm. "Why?" he said, and the question was not hostile. It was the specific question of a man who had just been told something that required him to update his entire model of a person and who needed the full data set before he completed the update. She looked at him, at the silver-gray eyes and the scarred temples, and the man who had been a wounded officer and was now the most dangerous thing in the room and had spent 11 years being carefully navigated by a person he trusted with the inner architecture of everything he'd built. "Because he used me to get to you," she said, 10 years ago and now. Both times as an instrument, both times without asking me. Her hands pressed harder on the table surface. "I'm done being an instrument." Something moved through Lucien's face that she had no clean name for. It was not warmth. That was still the wrong category. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific wound for a long time and has just received information that changes the nature of it. Not heals it, not closes it, but reframes it in a way that makes it survivable to look at directly. He moved around the table. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin to maintain the eye line, and his hand came up and found her jaw, not roughly, with the same precise care he applied to everything. The care of a man for whom touch was primary information gathering and tenderness and threat assessment had long since become the same gesture. "The 24 hours, he said. "Were you going to need them?" "No," she said. He held that for 2 seconds. Then his hand dropped and he turned back to the table, and she watched the quality of him shift. The last of whatever had been managing toward her in the past 3 weeks redistributed into something colder and more absolute. The quality of a man who had been handed the coordinates of a wound he had not known the location of and was done waiting to address it. "Send Ren to me," he said. His voice had returned to the register she recognized from the terrace, the voice that didn't perform anything because it was operating from a level below performance, from the level where the actual decisions lived. "And stay in the East Wing until I come to you." "What are you going to do?" He placed both hands on the operational map spread across the table, and his head dropped slightly, and she watched the complete rerouting of 11 years of trust and proximity and careful architecture into something that had no more use for any of that. "What I should have done," he said, "when I first suspected him." He raised his head, and Serafina understood, in the specific moment when she saw what had replaced the composure in his face, that the man her father had been trying to neutralize, the political figure, the military legend, the carefully managed threat, had just finished being that man. What was standing at the war room table now was something that preceded all of those categories. Something that had survived a civil war and an explosion and 10 years of building power in an empire that wanted him controlled, and had done all of it by understanding, at a cellular level, that the only response to being used as an instrument is to become something no one can afford to pick up. She went to find Ren. Behind her, in the war chamber, the Empire's most feared man began dismantling the closest thing he had ever allowed to trust. And the sound of it, the specific quality of silence that followed, was the sound of a door closing on everything that had existed before it. There was no version of what came next that looked like before. Kaelin Voss was arrested at the dinner hour. Not loudly. Lucien didn't do anything loudly. He did it the way he did everything, with the precise economy of a man who understood that spectacle was for people who needed the room to know they had won, and that genuine power never needed the room to know anything at all. 3 of Ren's men. A corridor. A conversation that lasted 40 seconds by Seraphina's count from the East Wing staircase where she was standing and absolutely not watching, except that she was watching, because some things you cannot make yourself not witness. Kaelin went without resistance, which told her he had considered this outcome, had perhaps even planned for it, and had concluded that his position was survivable if he managed it correctly from custody. The expression on his face as Ren's men flanked him was not the expression of a man who had been caught. It was the expression of a man advancing to the next phase of a sequence. She stayed on the staircase until the corridor was empty. Then she went to find Lucien. He was in the war chamber again, standing at the table, and the maps had been cleared and replaced with something else. The operational documents of whatever he had been running for the past 72 hours since their conversation, the architecture of a response she had not been given full access to, and was beginning to understand was considerably larger than Kaelin's arrest. "The banquet," she said from the doorway. He didn't turn. 3 days. The Imperial Unity Banquet. The Empire's annual formal convening of the major houses. Mandatory attendance, neutralized ground by centuries of protocol. The one event where the political geography of the year was displayed in seating arrangements and conversation partners, and the specific quality of acknowledgement between people who spent the rest of the calendar avoiding each other. Her father would be there. Every house aligned against Darkent would be there. And Lucien, she now understood, had been planning to be there in a capacity that had nothing to do with the diplomatic performance the Empire expected from him. "You're going to move at the banquet," she said. "Kaelin's arrest gives us a 72-hour window before the Coalition understands what it means." He turned then, and the quality of his face in the war room light was the quality she had seen developing since the night she'd walked him into the Ardennes disclosure. The complete absence of the management layer, the thing underneath fully operational. They'll interpret it as a household matter, internal. By the time they recalibrate, we'll be inside the event, and they won't have a clean response option. And the file, the evidence my father built. Addressed. He moved to the table, laid his hand on a specific document. Essien's collection was acquired this morning, privately. The originals are here. The copies your father's legal team was working from have been replaced with versions that don't support the testimony structure. She stared at him. "You've had this for how long?" "The acquisition was finalized 6 hours ago." "Lucien, how long have you been working toward this?" A pause. The specific pause of a man deciding how much of his operational timeline to disclose. "Since the 4th day of our marriage," he said, "when I identified the channel your father was using to route correspondence into the household." She absorbed this. "You knew about the correspondence channel." "I let it run," he said, "to see what came through it and what your response would be." He paused again. "I needed to know which direction you would move when the pressure arrived." She held that for 3 seconds. The specific quality of being tested, not maliciously, but with the cold pragmatism of a man who had learned in the worst possible way the cost of misplacing his red on someone's loyalties. "You could have told me," she said. "I'm telling you now." She wanted to be angry about it. She examined the anger, found it was real, found underneath it something more complicated. The understanding that she would have done exactly the same thing. That she had in fact done exactly the same thing. Held information, watched the geometry, waited for the moment when the choice was forced, and the response was authentic. They were, she was discovering, built from similar damage. "What do you need from me at the banquet?" she said. He told her. The Imperial Unity Banquet was held in the Crystal Hall of the Volantis Central Palace, a space designed 300 years ago by an architect who understood that power needed to be visible to be believed, and had created accordingly a room that made everything inside it feel simultaneously observed and exposed. Walls of leaded glass, chandeliers engineered to cast no shadows, a floor that amplified sound in specific frequencies, which meant that conversations carried further than they should, and that footsteps arrived before their owners did. It was, in other words, a room designed for people who had nothing to hide. Everyone in it was hiding something. Serafina arrived on Lucian's arm, which she had done once before, the wedding reception, and which carried a different quality now. 3 weeks of marriage and a war room conversation and a betrayal she had chosen against had changed the geometry of standing next to him. She was not performing proximity. She was inside it. He had not touched her arm in the receiving line. He had held it. The distinction was physical and deliberate, and communicated something to the room that she could watch arriving in the faces of the people they passed, the recalibration of assumption, the rapid reassessment of what Darkent Vale actually meant as a political unit versus what they had projected it would mean. They had expected a managed arrangement. They were reading something else. Her father was at the eastern cluster of tables. She found him within 30 seconds of entry, which was reflex. 23 years of tracking Lord Aldrich Vale's position in rooms had made it automatic. He was speaking with 2 men she recognized as members of the Coalition's legal structure, and his posture was the posture of a man who had received information in the past 72 hours and was managing its implications. Kaelin's arrest had reached him. He knew the timeline had compressed. He looked up and found her across the room. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. She felt his assessment tracking them, Lucien's hand at her arm, the quality of their movement through the room, the specific signal of a daughter who had been given a choice and had made the one her father had not planned for. She felt something leave her face that she hadn't known was still there. The last residue of the performance she'd been running since childhood, the careful, maintained expression of a daughter who was managing her father's consequences and calling it loyalty. It left, and what was underneath it was not soft. Lucian felt the change. His hand tightened fractionally on her arm. Not comfort, acknowledgement, the physical equivalent of noted. They took their seats. The banquet proceeded through its first 2 hours with the formal precision that these events existed to display. Speeches, the ritual acknowledgement of the imperial house, the orchestrated mingling between courses during which the real business of the evening was conducted in the careful language of people saying one thing and meaning 4 others. Lucienne spoke to 7 people. She counted. Each conversation lasted under 3 minutes, and each ended with the other person returning to their seat with the particular quality of a man who has received information he needs to immediately process, which was exactly what had happened, because Lucienne was not making conversation. He was delivering finalities. She spoke to 2 people, Countess Voss, who was not related to Kaelin and was managing the anxiety of that coincidence with varying success, and a young attaché from the northern houses who was clearly gathering intelligence for his principal and had not yet learned to conceal it. She gave him nothing useful and watched him recalibrate and felt the specific cold satisfaction of having been correctly read as a target and having given the reader nothing to work with. An hour before the formal close of the banquet, the lights went out. Not all of them. The Crystal Hall had 7 distinct lighting circuits, a fact that Serafina knew because Lucienne had told her, sitting across the war room table 3 nights ago with a floor plan spread between them and the specific quality of a man briefing a partner rather than deploying an asset. The eastern circuits went first, then the northern. The remaining 3 held, casting the room in a warm, directionless light that eliminated shadow cover and made the exits clearly visible, which was the operational intent. In the darkness of the first 2 seconds, before the remaining circuits held and the room understood what was happening, there was a movement near the western service entrance that Serafina tracked because she had been tracking that specific entrance for 40 minutes per Lucian's instruction. 3 men, not staff. The quality of their movement, low center of gravity coordinated, the specific economy of people who were not here to serve anything, was legible to her in the half-dark the way it would not have been legible 6 weeks ago. She was on her feet before the room started responding. Southwest, she said to Wren, who was already moving. The crystal hall erupted, not into panic immediately. The first 15 seconds were the frozen quality of a room that did not yet have a consensus interpretation of what was occurring. Then the western service door came open fully, and the three men were no longer managing concealment, and the room's consensus arrived all at once, and the sound of 400 people finding their survival instincts simultaneously was enormous and specific, and she moved through it the way Lucienne had described moving through a battlefield, with the crowd as cover, not obstacle, using the direction of mass movement to navigate against it. She was looking for her father. She found him at the eastern wall. He had not moved toward the exits. He was watching the western entrance with the quality of a man observing an operation he had initiated, and the two men flanking him were not his usual staff. They were the same quality of person as the three near the western door, same economy of movement, same ground-level center of gravity, same complete absence of the social performance that actual guests were currently producing at volume. She stopped 8 feet from him. Serafina. His voice was entirely composed. Lord Aldrich Vale, in 30 years of navigating imperial politics, had developed a composure that could survive most things. Come with me. No, she said. He studied her. The particular quality of his assessment, the one she had been subject to since childhood, the one that valued her instrumentality and had never fully resolved the dissonance of her refusal to perform it cleanly, arrived and completed itself in about 2 seconds. The men at the western door are a distraction, he said. The actual operation is in the north corridor. The Duke will be occupied for the next 4 minutes. Come with me now, and I will ensure you're protected from what comes after. She looked at her father, at the composed, aristocratic face and the careful eyes, and the man who had placed her in an abandoned chapel at 17 and placed her in a marriage at 23 and called both of them protection. Where is he? She said. Serafina. Where is Lucienne? Her father's expression shifted. Not much. The fraction of shift that meant he had recalculated her value in his operational structure and arrived at a number that was lower than it had been 30 seconds ago. The North Corridor. But the operation, she was already moving. The North Corridor connected the Crystal Hall to the formal receiving rooms of the Imperial Wing, and in the chaos of the evacuation, it was operating against the primary flow. The guests were moving south and east toward the main exits, which meant the North Corridor was nearly empty when she entered it, which meant she heard it clearly. 3 men on 1. The sounds were specific. The particular acoustic signature of a fight conducted in a confined space by people who knew what they were doing, the economy of it, no wasted motion, no performance, just the brutal, functional language of people trying to end something quickly. She came around the corner and saw them. Lucien had his back to the wall, the deliberate positioning of a man who had made a decision about the geometry before the engagement started, who had chosen the wall because it eliminated the attack vector from behind and narrowed the field to what he could manage without vision. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. There was blood at his temple. Not much, not yet. And his face had the absolute quality of a man operating entirely from something below conscious decision-making, the level where the body runs its own survival architecture and the mind just does what it's told. 2 of the 3 men were down. The third was the problem. He was good. Better than the other 2, the quality of a professional rather than hired force. And he knew about the blindness and was using it, moving in the frequencies below what hearing and air pressure and floor vibration could reliably track, the specific educated attack pattern of someone who had been briefed on Lucien's compensatory systems and had built a counter to them. Lucien was bleeding the engagement, taking ground, managing it, but the third man was landing, and the wall behind him was now a disadvantage because it was eliminating his movement options along with the attack vector. Serafina picked up the decorative iron stand from the corridor alcove to her left. She did not think about it. She did not calculate it. The calculation had been done sometime in the past 3 weeks, in a specific internal accounting she had not consciously completed, but that her body had apparently been running independently, and the result was that she crossed the corridor in 6 steps and brought the stand down across the third man's knee from behind with everything she had. He went down. Not cleanly. He had the professional's reflex and managed a partial recovery, turned, and she got his forearm instead of his head when he raised it, which was still enough. The forearm broke, and the sound of it was very specific, and he went down the rest of the way. Silence. Lucien was breathing hard. His hand found the wall, and he oriented on it, tracking her position from the sound of her breathing in the sudden quiet. "Serafina," he said. His voice was raw, the specific rawness of a man who has been fighting in a confined space for 2 minutes and has not finished deciding if he is going to survive it. "I'm here," she said. She crossed to him. His hand found her shoulder, and the grip of it was the grip of someone confirming physical reality, confirming that what the other senses were reporting was accurate. "Your father's men," he said. "Yes. He's still in the hall." Something moved through his face. The specific expression of a man finishing a calculation he had started 3 weeks ago and arriving at a conclusion he had been holding at arm's length. "The operation," he said. "The 3 at the western door. Were they real?" She thought of her father's composed face, the timing of his offer, the quality of a man observing an event he had authored. Distraction. "He wanted you here while something else ran." Lucien went very still. Then, "The imperial documents." He turned toward her, and the quality of his focus had changed from the immediate to the architectural, the rapid extension of analysis from the engagement they'd just survived to its purpose, its function, what it had been covering. "The Essien originals. I moved them this morning to the secondary archive in the East Tower." His voice had dropped to the register that meant the worst version of a calculation had just been confirmed. "If someone knew they'd been moved—" "Kalen," she said. Kalen knew the acquisition timeline. His jaw tightened by a fraction. He knew the secondary archive location. He was in custody, but he had 12 hours before the arrest in which he could have transmitted. He was already moving. She matched his pace without being asked, which was new and which neither of them acknowledged, through the north corridor back toward the main palace interior, and the sounds of the Crystal Hall's managed evacuation were behind them, and the sound of the Empire reorienting itself around a power structure that had just been attacked in its ceremonial center was everywhere, in the quality of voices and running feet, and the specific frequency of a building that understood something had changed. She kept pace with him through 3 corridors and a staircase and the long marble passage to the East Tower, and she was aware of the blood at his temple and the tear in his jacket, and the specific quality of him in motion. The total navigational fluency, the absolute economy. A man who had been damaged in ways that should have diminished him, and had instead built compensatory systems that made him more dangerous than before. Not despite the damage, but through the specific architecture it had forced him to construct. She thought, "This is what my father never understood." He thought blindness was a vulnerability. He had been building operations around it for 11 years. The chapel, the placement, the Kalen investment, all of it predicated on the assumption that a man who could not see was a man who could be managed from the margins of his perception. He had not understood that the margins were exactly where Lucien was most dangerous. They reached the East Tower door. It was open. Lucien stopped. She stopped beside him. The door was open, and the guard who should have been posted at it was not there, and the quality of the open door in the context of everything that had just happened in the North Corridor and the Crystal Hall and the 3 weeks of a marriage that had become something neither of them had briefed for. The quality of that open door was the quality of a conclusion arriving at full speed. Lucien said nothing. She could feel the specific quality of what was happening in him, the complete inventory of what this meant, the Kalen transmission, and the distraction at the western door in her father's composed face, and the timing of all of it assembling into the shape of an operation that had been years in the construction, and was now, tonight, either succeeding or failing at its critical juncture. She felt his hand find the back of her arm, not restraining, anchoring. The same grip from the corridor, confirming physical reality, confirming that whatever came through that door, they were not facing it from separate positions. "Stay close," he said. His voice had the quality she recognized now as the bottom register, the one below performance, below management, below everything except the essential fact of a man who had decided what he was and was done negotiating it. He went through the door, she went with him. The East Tower staircase spiraled upward in the particular darkness of a space whose lanterns had been extinguished, and from somewhere above them came the sounds of the archive room. and a voice she recognized, speaking in the low, precise tone of a man directing an operation in its final phase. Her father's voice. Lucien's hand released her arm, and she understood, in the cold and the dark, and the specific quality of a night that had been building toward this exact point since a wedding reception 3 weeks ago and a chapel 10 years before that, that there was no clean exit from what was above them. No diplomatic version, no managed outcome. There was only what they walked into and what they walked out of, and whether, when it was over, the Empire's most feared man was going to be standing. The East Tower archive room was not large. That was the first thing Serafina registered when she came through the door behind Lucien. The specific compression of a space that had been designed for storage rather than occupation. The shelving units running floor to ceiling on 3 walls. The central table. The single high window admitting the cold blue of a night that had passed midnight without anyone marking it. The Essian documents were on the table, opened, partially sorted into the organized configuration of someone who had been working through them with purpose. Her father stood at the far end of the table. 2 men flanked him. The same quality of professional she had encountered in the North Corridor, the same ground-level center of gravity, same absence of social performance. One of them had a hand inside his jacket. Lord Aldrich Vale looked at his daughter, and then at the man beside her, and his face did the accounting in approximately 2 seconds. "Lucien," he said, with the composed pronunciation of a man who had been preparing this conversation for longer than the evening. Lucien said nothing. He had stopped 3 feet inside the door. His orientation was precise. He had the room mapped from the entry, the positions of the 3 people registered through the floor and the air and the specific quality of sound in a confined space, and he was standing with the particular stillness of a man who had decided to give the room one opportunity to resolve itself without escalation. The man with his hand inside his jacket was the variable. Serafina tracked him the way Lucien had taught her without meaning to. Not by looking directly, but by maintaining peripheral awareness. The specific peripheral awareness of someone who has learned that the thing you're watching directly is rarely the thing that moves first. "The documents are already compromised," her father said. He did not look at the man with his hand in his jacket. He looked at Lucien, which was either confidence or the performance of it, and with her father she had long since stopped being able to reliably distinguish between the two. 3 copies have been transmitted to the Imperial Council's receiving office tonight. Whatever you do in this room doesn't change that. "It doesn't need to," Lucien said. His voice was the bottom register, the one she recognized as the level below strategy, the level where the essential facts lived. "The Council already has my response. Filed 2 hours ago." Her father's composure shifted. A fraction. The fraction of a man whose operational timeline has just been informed it was running against a counter-sequence he hadn't mapped. "You knew about the transmission." "I knew about Kaelin's communication from custody." Lucien moved 1 step into the room, not toward her father, toward the center, the geometric middle of the space, which changed the angles for everyone in it simultaneously. "I've known since this morning that the archive operation was a second axis. The banquet engagement was designed to keep me occupied while the documents moved." He paused. "So I moved them back. What's on that table is not the Essian material." Silence. Her father looked at the documents, the specific look of a man running a rapid authentication against what he believed he had verified, finding the seam in it. "You let the operation run," her father said. "I let it reach you," Lucien said. "Specifically." The room held that for 3 seconds. Serafina watched her father's face complete its accounting and arrive at the conclusion that the sequence he had spent 11 years building had not failed tonight. It had been allowed to arrive here, to this room, at this moment, by a man who wanted the geography to be exactly this: contained, documented, witnessed, with no exit path that didn't run through Lucien d'Arquent. The man with his hand inside his jacket made a decision. Lucien was already moving. What happened in the next 14 seconds was not elegant. It was not the choreographed quality of a man performing capability. It was the raw economic brutality of someone who had spent 20 years learning to fight without the sense that most combat systems assumed as prerequisite, who had developed compensatory systems that were not substitutions for vision, but genuinely different instruments, faster in specific ways because they processed in parallel rather than sequential, because they didn't require the confirmation step that vision demanded. He took the first man before the jacket opened. The second came off the wall, and Serafina threw the iron document stand from the table, and it caught him at the shoulder and he staggered, and Lucien finished it, and the sound of the second man hitting the shelving unit was very loud in the small room, and then it was quiet. Her father had not moved. He was standing at the far end of the table, and he had not moved, because Lord Aldrich Vale had always understood the precise moment at which movement became more dangerous than stillness, and this was that moment, and he was standing in it with his hands visible and his face doing the thing it did. The complete, unreadable composure of a man who had not yet found the edge of what he could manage. Lucien straightened. His breathing was elevated. The blood at his temple from the north corridor had tracked down the line of his jaw and dried there, dark against his skin. His jacket was destroyed. He stood in the center of the archive room with the specific quality of presence that the Empire had been building narratives around for a decade, and Serafina understood, watching him, that the narratives had been inadequate. Not because they exaggerated, because they had tried to describe something in the language of legend that was actually something much simpler and much more difficult. A man who had been taken apart by the world and had rebuilt himself from the remaining components without softening any of the edges. That kind of person was not fearsome because of what they could do. They were fearsome because of what they had already survived. "Lord Vale," Lucien said. His voice was entirely level. "Sit down." Her father sat. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes. Serafina stood at the window. She did not participate. This was not because she had been excluded. It was because she understood, watching the quality of the two men across the table from each other, that this conversation was not one she could speak into without changing what it was. It was the specific conversation of two people who had been running operations against each other for 11 years, reaching the end of the operational period, doing the accounting. Her father was precise. She had always known he was precise. It was the quality she had inherited from him, the one she had spent 23 years alternately grateful for and disgusted by. He presented his position without evasion, which was the strategy of a man who understood that evasion in front of Lucien d'Arquent was a waste of energy that could be redirected toward negotiation. He had the copies transmitted to the council. That was real. He had testimony from two sources that was not Kalen, whose credibility was now destroyed, but who had been replaced in the structure by other arrangements. That was also real. What he did not have was the Essien originals, the physical evidence that gave the testimony its evidentiary spine. What he did not have was the counterfiling Lucien had placed with the council 2 hours ago, the content of which he was learning now for the first time, and whose scope she watched arrive in his face with the specific quality of a man understanding that the board he thought he was playing had been reset underneath him without his awareness. What he did not have, and what she watched him understand he did not have, was time. The window she had been given, her choice, Kalen's dinner hour, the 24 hours, had not been a window at all. It had been a mechanism. Her decision to go to Lucien had closed a sequence that her father had not known was running, had triggered the counterfiling, had confirmed for Lucien's intelligence network which documents were real and which were the operational decoys her father had been tracking. She had not been tested. She had been the fulcrum. She looked at the night through the high archive window and felt something she could not name working its way through the architecture of everything she had built around her father's survival. Not grief. Grief was for things that were lost, and what was happening in this room was not loss but the end of a performance. She had been running so long she had stopped being able to see the edges of it. 23 years of calculating around him. 23 years of being the instrument that managed consequences. The chapel and the marriage and the letter through Kalen's channel and the dinner hour deadline. Every interaction in her memory was reorganizing itself around the new information, the full information, the picture she had refused to complete because completing it meant putting down something she had been carrying so long it felt like part of her own weight. It did not feel like relief when it left. It felt like standing up after a very long time on your knees and discovering that the position had changed the structure of what upright meant. Her father's voice from the table. And Serafina. She turned. He was looking at her. For the first time in the 40 minutes of the conversation, he was looking at her rather than at Lucien, and the quality of his look was the one she had spent her life trying to correctly read. The one that she had, at various points, interpreted as love, as calculation, as professional assessment, as the particular expression of a man who valued an asset and was running the current valuation. She understood now that all of those interpretations had been partially correct, that they were not mutually exclusive, that her father was a man who had never fully resolved the dissonance between those categories, who had loved her and deployed her in the same breath without experiencing contradiction. Because, in the architecture of Aldrich Vale's understanding, the two things were not in conflict. That was not a wound she could close tonight, but it was one she could, finally, name accurately. She made her choice, Lucian said. He did not look at Serafina. He kept his attention on her father with the precision he gave everything. 3 weeks ago and again tonight. That's not part of this negotiation. Her father held Lucien's non-gaze for a long moment. You trust her? Yes. The single syllable delivered in the bottom register, with the absolute quality of a man stating a fact that had been tested and confirmed and was no longer a subject for external commentary. Her father looked at her one more time. The full accounting, the one she had been waiting her whole life to receive and had stopped expecting to survive intact. It arrived and completed itself, and he looked away. And in the looking away, she recognized the specific expression of a man who has understood something about himself that he will not speak out loud and will not act on, and will carry in the private architecture of whatever he has, instead of the things other people call a conscience. It was not the closure she had imagined when she was 17. But it was the true version of it, and she had lived long enough to understand that those were rarely the same thing. Her father was escorted out of the Empire's formal territory within 6 days, not executed, which surprised the aristocracy and which Serafina understood was not mercy. It was precision. Execution created martyrs, and martyrs created narratives that outlived the people who built them. What Lucian had constructed instead was a legal and financial architecture so thorough and so completely sealed that Lord Aldrich Vale's continued existence was the most complete possible proof of his powerlessness. He was alive. He had nothing. Every instrument he had built and placed and invested and positioned over 30 years of imperial maneuvering had been catalogued and dismantled by a man who had spent 11 years learning exactly where they were. Alive and nothing. That was the verdict. Serafina did not attend the formal proceeding. She sat in the east garden of Darkent Palace on the morning it concluded, and listened to the jasmine move in the early wind, and did not perform anything for anyone, which was its own kind of landmark. Lucian found her there in the late morning. He moved through the garden with the navigational fluency she had stopped noticing because it had become the baseline of how he occupied space, and he sat beside her on the stone bench without announcement, without preamble, in the specific way of a man who had decided that the performance cost of social entry conventions was not worth paying in the presence of someone who already knew what he was. They sat in silence for a while. The jasmine was very strong. "How are you?" he said, not as a formality, as the precise direct inquiry of a man who had replaced small talk with actual questions long enough ago that he no longer remembered the difference. She thought about it, which he would wait for. She had learned that about him. He asked things because he wanted the answer, and he would wait for the accurate one rather than accept the available one. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I've been so long in the habit of managing him that I'm not sure what I do now with the energy that used to go there." He was quiet for a moment. It takes time to stop bracing for something that isn't coming anymore. She looked at him, the scarring at his temples, the particular quality of his face in daylight, more human than it appeared in rooms designed for political display, the lines of it older than 32, older than his rank, carrying the specific mileage of a man who had been inside several different categories of damage and had come out the other side each time not unscathed but functional. "Is that from experience?" she said. "I spent 2 years after the Ardennes bracing for the dark," he said. "Every time I was in a space I hadn't mapped yet. The absence of vision felt like a precondition for damage, for a long time." He paused. "Then at some point it just felt like how I moved through the world. And then, eventually it felt like an advantage." Another pause. "That progression took longer than I wanted it to." She held that. "What changed it?" He turned toward her, the precise orientation of a man finding a location through other instruments. "I stopped waiting to feel like myself again, and accepted that the self I was waiting to recover was gone. What was left was something different, possibly better, definitely more honest. His voice had the quality it got when he was saying things he had worked out in private and had not previously said out loud. You can't grieve the self you lost and build the one you are at the same time. Eventually, you have to choose. She looked at the jasmine on the trellis wall. The light through it made patterns on the stone that shifted when the wind moved. I've been grieving for a long time, she said. Not him, specifically. The version of everything I thought I was protecting when I stayed quiet. She paused. The version of a family that was worth the cost of the chapel. He said nothing, which was the right response. It wasn't, she said. Not with bitterness. She had examined it and found the accurate answer and was stating it with the precision he had, without meaning to, made her better at. The family I was protecting didn't exist in the form I believed it did. I was protecting a structure, not the people inside it. Most people do, he said. Protect the structure. It's easier to hold than the actual thing. She looked at him. Did you? Ever? A long pause. The quality of a man running an honest inventory. The empire, he said, for years. I protected the structural concept of it, the institution, the function, because the actual thing, the people, and the decisions, and the specific men who benefited from what I was doing for it, those didn't hold up to examination. He paused. It was easier to serve an idea. And now, he turned toward her again, and the silver-gray eyes that could not see her face and saw her anyway were doing the thing they did. The complete non-performative attention of a man for whom focus was the primary form of honesty he had left. Now I protect specific things, he said. Specific people. Ones I've examined and found worth the cost. The jasmine moved. She felt the specific quality of something settling in her chest, not the settling of relief, not the lightness of resolution, but the denser and more durable settling of something that has been tested and has held. The kind of trust that does not arrive early, that cannot be performed into existence, that requires exactly the specific sequence of a chapel and a wedding and a terrace and a war room and an archive room and a stone bench in a garden to build it to the weight it needs to be to last. She put her hand on the bench between them. He found it. His fingers closed around hers with the same precise care as the first time. The care of a man for whom touch was information and confirmation and the most honest language he had available, and she let him hold it and felt the quality of it and did not perform anything in response to it, which meant what she felt was real. There are things I should have told you sooner, she said, in the archive room, about what I knew and what I chose. I gave you the shape of it. I didn't give you all of it. I know, he said. You're not going to ask. I'm waiting for you to be ready to give it. He paused. There's a difference. She looked at him. At the man who had been an instrument and had refused to remain one, who had been blinded and had built something in the place of the missing sense that was more precise and more honest than what most people did with their full complement of faculties, who had been placed in proximity to her twice by a man who understood neither of them and had gotten the outcome he deserved, who had, at the bottom of everything, asked her a single question on a wedding night that contained all the other questions, whether the girl who put a map in his hand and said, "Go," had known what came after it, and who had heard the answer, "Yes," and had not walked away. "Lucienne," she said. "Yes." "The dance," she said. "On the wedding night. You asked before midnight." He was quiet for a moment. She felt something move in the quality of his hand around hers, not tighter, but different. The shift of a man who has been running hard for a very long time and has encountered something that allows him, for the first time in the running, to be completely still. "I knew within 40 minutes, he said. "I told you that." "I know. I'm asking. When you asked for the dance, before you confirmed it, when you asked." She paused. "Did you already know?" A long pause. The honest kind. The kind that was long because the accurate answer required excavating past the operational version to the true version underneath. "I suspected," he said finally, "since the receiving line. The way you held yourself near the eastern windows, the specific quality of your voice when you were managing a conversation versus when you were inside one." He paused. "And the jasmine. From the moment I walked into the reception." You asked anyway. I asked because of that, he said, not despite it. She held that, felt the full weight of it, the specific choice of a man who had suspected, who had 10 years of reasons to confirm suspicion from a distance and take the safer route, who had instead asked for a dance before midnight and walked them both to the edge of everything. The choice was not reckless. That was the thing she needed him to know she understood. It was the choice of a man who had learned, through damage and through the specific construction that followed damage, that the safer route was the more expensive one in the long run, that the things worth having required the willingness to walk toward the version of events that could destroy you, because the alternative was the guaranteed destruction of managing your life entirely from a defensive position. She had learned that too, the slow way, through the same damage by different instruments. 2 years from now, she said, what does this look like? He considered it. The specific quality of a man building a picture from real components rather than hoped-for ones. The empire is quieter, he said. Not peaceful. That's not what empires do. But the specific fractures that were being exploited for the past decade will be closed because the people exploiting them will have run out of leverage. He paused. Darkent will not be more powerful in the formal sense. It will be more definitive, the kind of position that doesn't require demonstration. And us, she said. The garden held the question for a moment. Still here, he said. Specifically here. This bench. Something moved in his face, by not a smile because he didn't default to those, but the quality of expression that occupied the same territory and was more honest because it hadn't been trained into performance. You will have told me the rest of what you're holding. I will have told you the rest of what I ran during those 3 weeks without informing you. We will have had that argument. Was it a bad one? It was very bad, he said. And then it was over. She looked at the jasmine, at the light through it and the patterns on the stone and the specific quality of a morning that had arrived after a night that had contained the full weight of everything that preceded it and had not, despite that weight, broken either of them. There was no clean accounting for what it had cost. The chapel and the war and the Ardennes and the 10 years and the marriage that was meant to be a managed arrangement and had become instead the thing that nothing in either of their histories had fully prepared them for, which was the specific irreducible experience of being known by someone who had every reason not to and had chosen to anyway. She had not been made better by it. That was not how any of this worked. She was not resolved into a simpler or more comfortable version of herself. She was more accurate about herself, about what she had done and chosen and avoided, about the weight she had been carrying under the name of protection and what it had actually been, which was something more complicated and less noble, about the specific difference between surviving and living, which she had been confusing for 23 years and was only now beginning to separate into their correct categories. That was not redemption exactly. Redemption implied a return to something prior, a restoration of a self that had existed before the damage. What she had was something harder and more honest, the self that had been built from the damage, examined clearly, and found functional, found, against expectation, sufficient. Lucien's hand was still around hers on the cold stone bench. The jasmine moved on the morning wind. From somewhere inside the palace came the sounds of the household resuming its operations, the specific sounds of a structure that had been tested at its foundations and had held, returning to the particular rhythms of a day that was, despite everything, ordinary. Footsteps. A door. The distant voice of someone issuing instruction. Life, resuming, the way it always did. Not because the wreckage had been cleared, but because the wreckage was now part of the terrain, and terrain is what you navigate from, not away from. Lucien, she said. Yes. I'm going to tell you the rest of it, she said. Today. Not because I'm ready, because you've been waiting long enough. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Not thank you. Not the performance of receiving something he'd been owed, just the simple, clean acknowledgement of a man who had asked for the accurate version of things and was prepared to sit with whatever that turned out to contain. She turned toward him on the bench. He oriented toward her, the precise, unhurried orientation of a man who had all the attention in the world and had chosen, specifically, to put it here. Above them, the jasmine moved in the warm morning wind. And the Empire's most feared man, and the woman who had once put a map in his hand and told him to go, who had brought each other through damage and war and the specific wreckage of things they had both handled badly and survived anyway, sat in the quiet garden and began, at last, to tell each other the truth. Not because it was safe, because they had both learned, the long and expensive way, that safe was the wrong thing to protect.